Hi everyone, I'm Hessie Jones and I am from our company. Tonight is our third installment of the Blended Generation Think Tank, and tonight we're going to dive into the definition of what is a millennial mindset. So this is, I wrote a blog post about this. I see this, and I think most people see it, as a prevailing view that seems to transcend a lot of generations. Well, most of us hate stereotypes, and this is the reason why we do what we do, because we want to debunk a lot of the stereotypes that are out there about the different generations. This is one dominant label that seems to be used as a measuring stick across generations. So tonight we have Gen X, we have Millennials, we have Boomers that are coming together to kind of provide a deeper insight into the definition of what is a millennial mindset and how they actually perceive themselves within this looming label. So how this actually came about, there was one day, and Kristen remembers this, I was actually talking to Kristen about hiring somebody for a community role, and she said, oh, there's this great person, she's a Gen Xer, but she has a millennial mindset. And I go, what the heck is a millennial mindset? Now, this wasn't the first time this happened. Actually, I was, and Mila remembers this as well, I was trying to recruit people for a Gen X think tank session on finance. The one thing I realized is that some of the people that were being recruited into that group realized that they weren't really identifying with some of the people within that group, right? And whether or not, and I started to determine whether or not, was it that they didn't want to admit that they were that generation, or did they actually see themselves falling into another camp? And so the one thing I did was I actually went into Facebook and I actually asked the question, like, for all you Gen Xers out there, you know, tell me what is this millennial mindset and why you think that you are a millennial. My intention was really to get to the heart of the definition from many different perspectives, because it seemed like when I was talking about it, it was really all about what defines you as a generation, right? So the one thing that I realized right away was that people started piping up. And I don't know if you guys know Amy Vernon. Amy Vernon basically said, you know, I have to admit I'm really annoyed when people deny that they're Gen X, but it should come as no surprise to you. I think it's Gen X that easily adapts to new technology. We constantly deal with tech in all our lives. We're the ones that transitioned from, let's say, before the internet and let's say mainframes, if you guys remember mainframes, and Merlin, to the internet. And so they said that we adapt much better, but that could be said for any generation. So Mila, you're one of the ones that I actually spoke to as well, and I want you to tell your story and why, and whether or not you identified yourself as a Gen X or not, and how you saw yourself from the perspective of this millennial mindset. Okay. Did you want to talk about that?
Okay. Well, I think we hear a lot of different generalities about this millennial group of people, and one of the big things that I hear is the technology angle. So, I mean, focusing on the technology angle, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, yep.
Okay. Focusing on the technology angle, I find myself in my day-to-day life and throughout my life constantly being ahead of my peers in technology. And I am generally in workplaces that have several generations at this point in time, some much older, some much younger. And so I just can't relate to this idea that it's a generational issue when it comes to technology. So that's one of the main things where I don't like being boxed in as what we're hearing Gen X maybe, because we've got some people that are Gen X that might as well be boomers or something else, and then we've got some people that are Gen X that are more millennial mindset. Are we still good on sound? Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think for me, the main focus is from the technology side. I really can't say that I've really met any millennials who are way ahead of me in technology at all. So it's confusing to me, and that's where I have the problem identifying with these labels just in general. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it does. So I think before we get into it, what I'm going to do is have everybody state their name, what they do really quickly, and what generation they're from. That way, when we get into the questions, we'll understand from the context of which generation that your perspective is from. Okay, so let's start with Tiffany.
Tiffany Daniels. I am a millennial, an older millennial, and I work for nonprofit and government and community relations.
Okay, and Ross.
All right, Ross Quintana, and I'm a Gen X, and I do all kinds of stuff. It depends on my mood. Social media, marketing, consulting,
Okay.
whatever.
Are you, Ross, are you a younger Gen X or a middle Gen?
Yeah, I'm closer towards the millennial side, and so I hereby nominate this day, special New Generation Day, which is like the kind of younger Gen X and older millennial, because I think that there's quite a significant group that sit in that spot that in some ways kind of have, if you look at one end to the other, like maybe I can't relate to the ones that are closer to boomers because I'm just not getting that, and so it's like, I think that there's like some subcategories that kind of
No. Yeah, and I think we could definitely touch on that, and I'd love for you to bring that up if I do forget it. Okay, so Mila, you've already spoken, but can you just introduce yourself really quickly?
Yeah, I'm a director at a financial services firm in Montreal, and I'm also the producer of the 140 Conference Montreal. So I speak on to various groups about social media and how to integrate it into the workplace, and my focus has been a great deal on using social networks within the workplace as well. So that's a general overview, a bit of everything.
Okay, perfect. Kristen.
All right, I am 40 years old. I don't mind saying it, which makes me Gen X. I continue to think that I'm 28, but I'm 40. So there's that, and I am community manager for Social Business Hour, co-hosted by one of our other guests who will introduce himself momentarily.
Great. And I have to say that this was actually fortuitous because Kristen just wrote a post called Generation X with the Millennial Mindset. I want it all for all of us. And I think at some point, Kristen, we're going to have to talk about that during the session because it says a whole lot about what we're speaking about today. Okay, so a lot of the themes that you've talked about in your post, I'd like us to bring that up. Okay. Brian.
Sure, Brian Fanzo. I'm going with change evangelist as what I do now, but I host a podcast. I am a partner in a media group, keynote speaker on a bunch of different things, and I am proudly own and wear the badge of a millennial. I am 33, so I was born in 1980 at the very edge of the border, but I am proudly representing a millennial mindset.
Okay, and I have to say that like a lot of the stuff that you're doing, oh my God, am I actually echoing you guys? Okay, good, because I can hear it on my side. Brian, you guys, what you do at Millennial CEO is really cool as well because you actually host a show, actually a few shows where you bring in the perspective of millennials in different categories, including the future of work and all that stuff. So I want you to reference some of that as well because you have full context into the way millennials think, right? And so I want all that to come out tonight. And Bhupesh?
Bhupesh Shah, I'm a strategist and also program coordinator for the social media program here in Toronto at Seneca College. And I am a prenatal boomer.
A prenatal boomer?
Yeah, it's kind of like a baby boomer, but a little bit earlier than that. So
I was going to say you're not born. Prenatal means you're not born yet, so you're not born. Okay. Okay.
I don't fit into the boomer category, but I'm kind of there anyway. So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
work with me on this one. It's
I
kind
will.
of in the womb type of thing.
I will call you prenatal Bhupesh. Cool.
All right.
Okay, Beth.
Hi, I'm Beev Ethnic. I'm the owner of the Island Coffee House here on Anna Maria Island, and I, like Bhupesh, I don't know if you call me prenatal, but after I took I'm a boomer, supposedly, but not really. I'm, according to my score, I'm like a millennial more than most people are, so I don't fit in either, Bhupesh.
Okay. So what we're going to try to do before we actually delve into the whole thing about scores, because what I ask these guys to do is actually take a Pew Research, what's it called, test about whether or not you're a millennial. And I saw this actually on one of Brian Fanzo's posts a few weeks back. So I thought it would be fitting for everybody to actually take the test and see if there is a discrepancy between who their generation and who they're perceived to be based on the score. Okay, so one of the first questions I want to ask you guys is what traits specifically make you belong to your generation? And maybe the broader question is, do you feel like you belong to your generation? So who wants to start? Bev, do you want to start?
Well, for me, I guess I don't really feel like I fit my generation at all. I am 50, 56, one, I forget my age. Two, I quit corporate America like 3 years ago and moved here to the island. I moved from Tampa, which is a thriving metropolis. I was working for a hotel, and now I have a coffee shop that I am owner and working it every day, and I do things like, any new technology, I'm always on it and want to learn it, and so I guess I just don't really feel like I fit into that boomer generation, because I should be trying to retire by now, shouldn't I?
It depends. So it's your perception of what makes you different, and I think technology for you is the bigger differentiator between you and how you see, let's say, your peers and everyone else, right? Okay. Brian, I mean, you're definitely a millennial, but from let's say, and I hate to say labels and stereotypes, but you know them all. Like, do you identify with your generation?
So I think change, and I think that's partially why I say change evangelist. I think the rate at which innovation has happened in our lifetime of post high school, and I say ours as in those that are labeled with millennial, the rate at which that change has happened is something that we've never seen before. I mean, the fact that a VHS camcorder was around for years, and yet the DVD will only existed for really 4 years totally in the market. And my kids won't even know what a DVD ever existed, because a DVD, the span that it actually existed in our economy was very short. So for me, the rate at which change exists, the millennials almost have to be willing to fail fast. So that element of change is something I identify to exclusively.
Okay. Is there? Okay. Okay. I'm gonna withdraw. I was gonna ask you something else, but I'm gonna wait until the next one. Bhupesh.
I would say I don't fit into the traditional boomer definition, and I never really felt that I was a boomer. I mean, you read, as I was growing up and they were talking about boomers and sort of the boomer lifestyle, boomer behaviors, it never really fit in with me. I wasn't sort of that conservative, if you will. And as Bev was saying about technology, I've been adopting technology sort of as soon as I heard about something, and that's been sort of core in my being. I didn't feel that it was sort of consistent with being a millennial or a Gen X or something like that. It's not hidden in that way. It's almost like if you're awake and you're aware of what's going on in the world, you're going to see what the opportunities are and what the tools are, etc.
Now, okay, you're married to another, let's say, Gen Xer or Boomer?
Boomer.
Okay, so do you see is there a dichotomy between the two of you?
Massive, massive dichotomy, yes. And that's another reason why I don't think it's right to sort of have a broad label on prescribed behaviors for a particular generation. My wife does not do anything with, any social media, even things like using push bullet on an Android. That was like a really cool thing. Whereas I'm looking at all sorts of, tools and things to sort of be more productive and really just to make life easier. But that's not something that's within her realm of thinking.
Yeah, I think part of it, and we'll get into this about, environment and exposure to certain things and why some people are predisposed to things and not others. And then there's also this idea of complacency, right? So especially as you get older. Now, Kristen, I want you to reference some of the stuff in your post because you're a younger Gen Xer, and you see yourself as what?
Yeah, like I'm totally greedy. I'm just going to be honest. I am totally greedy, and I think that as a 40-year-old woman, I want to claim everything about my generation, which I'm very proud of, about being Gen X and having broken some of the barriers and accomplished some of the things that we have, but also the tendency of today's younger generation to be adventurous and be results-oriented and be, about scrapping the old in favor of the new when it's more efficient or better in some kind of way. I want all of that. I want to claim it all. So I'm proud to be Gen X, and I think that as Generation X, we've accomplished a great deal that perhaps is less documented than our millennials that are following us. But so I'm proud about being Gen X, but I'm open to change in a way that I think we typically attribute to younger people.
Okay, cool. Mila, so you can expand on what you said before at the outset of the start of the session. Do you identify with Gen X? I think you're muted.
I have to say that I can't help but think that all of these generational stereotypes were written by some people that are like way older boomers, because when I listen to, let's say, what Brian's saying, I can relate to that in my own youth. For example, we had beta. First of all, our computers were DOS-based. I mean, then we had to go into like Windows or Mac, and then you had your friends who had Mac, and you might have had Windows, or I don't even know if there was Windows. I may have skipped a stage there, but, and then we had beta tapes, and we had VHS tapes, and maybe some of us, maybe our parents had 8-tracks. I never used 8-tracks, but I saw them in my house, so I was aware of what they looked like. Then we had tapes, then we had CDs, then we had DVDs, so we've had a lot of the changes, and I'm pretty sure that every generation has had these kinds of changes, but I think what's really happening now is that the mainstream, all of society is joining together and getting involved in technology. Why? Because grandparents want to keep in touch with their grandkids, so then they eventually get forced onto Facebook, like all these grandparents are on Facebook now, and they're becoming more comfortable with it. But I don't know, like I have a really hard time with these labels, and from the as far as my own generation goes, my impression of what my generation has been is I think we've fought against a lot of norms, a lot of rigidity, but that was seen a couple of generation before too. So I mean, isn't it all just repeating itself, and we just give ourselves all these fancy labels, and people are just labeling things that they no longer understand? It's not the younger generations creating these labels. It's not Gen X and the Millennials who have created the current labels, I don't think. I think it's the older boomers who are like heading into retirement. So I don't know. I think we share a lot of qualities as human beings in general, and it's all about what we're exposed to and where we are. I mean, right now we're all on Google+. There's a whole group of people in each of our generations who would never, ever, ever be here on Google+. So just in itself, we're a segment that's a little bit different.
Right. And I think we can talk about that later too, but what I think the labels that predominate, that there is legitimate research behind it. The problem with the research is that in some cases what they try to do is they try to take a sample size and assume that that sample size is representative of a certain population. It's not necessarily true all the time, and that's the reason why we have to get into these nuanced discussions. So Ross, what do you think about this? You're a younger, so older millennial or younger Gen Xer. I guess you're straddling between the two, right?
I'm young Gen X, and the thing is just to touch on the point that you just made. That research is generally looks towards the mean, and so when you're thinking about Gen X, here's the little problem: is that the Gen Xers who are advanced wouldn't fit into those categories. So they were acting like millennials, now, so to speak, because they were outside of the norm of Gen X. So the early adoption of the Gen Xers, they already went through an adoption and a change that actually the environment didn't exist for them. So in some ways, if you compare that to what the millennials are doing when they were born into that environment, then there's a subset of millennials that would need to be thinking like the younger generation than them to match what the Gen Xers, that some of us are, to our generation. So I think there's a lot more, like I was saying before, there's more categories going on, and sometimes those generational groups are set on the average in that generation, so you're always going to have the outer edges that are either lagging behind or they're early adopters of the next generation. So. Yeah,
but one thing that you're saying here is that, especially from a technology perspective, because when we talk about adoption, it's typically technology that's the factor here, and what you're saying is that adoption is kind of synonymous with what this millennial mindset is about, and that you're saying the ones that are laggards don't necessarily fall into that. Is that right?
Yeah, and even beyond technology, it still applies even to the mindset, because there's early mindset adopters, and there's laggards, and you can see that kind of flowing over the adoption. Actually, I think it kind of shadows the adoption of technology. So there's a reason those people are going, well, do I need a website? And they don't even understand what mobile is. These are shadow ripples of their way of thinking. So even their mindset impacts their technology adoption, and those things feed off of each other.
Okay. Okay, I want to speak to Tiffany, who's a millennial. I wanted to ask you, okay, your handle is Reluctant Millennial. Can you explain that?
Sure. I am a millennial, and I'm not ashamed of being a millennial by any means, because ultimately for me that means when I was born. I am a millennial because I was born in the 80s. And the first question you asked for the group, and then on to the second part, the first question was what do I agree with the labels, or how do I define myself as a millennial? And more so than the mindset and the attitudes, I define myself as a millennial, or see where I fit with others that were born in the same era, because of the things that we experience. So as Brian kind of talked about the technology changes, I think that is definitely huge, but it's not unique to our generation. Every generation has seen more technological changes than any other generation, simply because we're all moving faster. So I fully expect Generation Z to blow us out of the water. And but the other thing is just things like 9/11. Where you were and what age you were and what part of your development defines how you experience that event. Unless, of course, you were there physically, then that's a whole different situation. But for those of us that were around the country experiencing it, what did that mean? Things like Columbine. For me, I was in middle school or junior high during Columbine, so that directly affected my education and the way that my parents reacted with me and the way that our teachers. And I think that's something that is unique to millennials rather than Gen X or boomers, simply because the age we were and what was happening in our lives and how we reacted to it. The reason I'm a reluctant millennial is because I work in corporate America, and more importantly, I work in workforce development. And the other side of the mindset that we haven't really touched on yet today of millennials is all of the bad things. The laziness, the entitlement, the lack of respect. And I sure know that I embrace those things at times, but I know how to operate in a business situation. And so when we're having it in a situation, in a conversation where I'm talking to CEOs or I'm talking to individuals that are considering hiring, I don't want them to consider millennial, because that is a negative term when you're looking at the mindsets or emotional maturity or whatever other terms we want to use for millennials. So age-wise, I'm a millennial, I'm 30, this is great, but I'm reluctant because I would rather be evaluated on how I present myself and what my references say and the work that I do than, oh, well, she must not know how to come to work on time. That's ridiculous.
Okay, so now let's talk about this, because a millennial mindset, for the most part, the definitions here are all negative and positive, and yet people will identify with the good stuff and say, well, no, you know, we get to choose who we are based on the good stuff, but you know what? I can separate myself from the bad stuff. So we can't necessarily do that, or can we? I'm asking you guys because it seems to me, and I've said this to a couple of people who've taken the test, and unfortunately Ryan can't be here. And this is one guy who separated himself from millennials because he's managed them, and so he's had a few bad experiences with millennials, and you know, he has a certain perception of who they are based on his experience. And yet, when he took the test, he ranked really high. He had it like a 97, and now he's all disillusioned because he's like, oh, I have no idea who I am anymore, right? And so I want you guys to talk about this. Like, I mean, can we be selective about the traits that
right? I'm happy to jump in on that from my view. I think there's a point. I mean, and so what Tiffany's saying is actually, I would say before 2014, I actually never proudly announced that I was a millennial. It was something that I never went out of my way to say. I was super proud of it. It was something that I was okay, you know, grouping myself. But it wasn't until a couple of people that I started mentoring, they actually would tell me, much like Tiffany said, that they were embarrassed to be associated with a millennial in certain aspects, in certain business situations, because of the stigma that went along with it. And I can tell you, I can remember the day where I was sitting when I heard that, because it flipped my switch to not only own it, but I announce it in every meeting. I announce it when I speak on the event, because I believe I'm going to change the perception of it by presenting those other things that we do great. And just because there's bad apples that are lazy and they've come across as entitled, and, you know, and I always reference the fact that, you know, I owned a pager at one day, so I didn't, you know, grow up in this age where, you know, I didn't have a pager. But I also kind of look at it from the sense of, yes, all generations are changed. Every generation, no one loves being labeled. But if you're going to label me, I want you to label me with this good and bad traits, but also not because of the year I'm born. So millennial mindset was my way of rallying the troops around, let's drive change, let's embrace technology, let's be open to everyone's decisions, let's have a more mindset that allows people to be happy. I don't care what they do in their home as long as they are happy. And that's my approach to it. And it wasn't people that were born in the 80s that only had that approach. I think it was lots of people had that approach. And for me, it was like a rallying cry. Like, I mean, and I it's something that I'm really passionate about, because even across millennials, a 24-year-old millennial, and I'm 33. I'm married for, you know, 10 plus years. I have 3 kids. I've worked for, you know, in a long life in certain jobs. I wouldn't say that I'm a traditional millennial, but a traditional, if you take one variable of data, which means the year you're born, and you try to label anybody on one variable, I think it's kind of impossible to do so. But with these myths and these things that are going around, the reason I took the stance to own that change was because I believed, you know, and I'll put this, and maybe this will be the question back, is millennials might come across as entitled, but we didn't give ourselves a first place trophy for everybody participating. Somebody else gave the millennial generation a participation trophy. And I think now it's about, don't reward everybody. Reward me for being great. If I am the best on the team, I better damn well be rewarded. But that means that if I am not, and I am not working towards success, that I am also okay with not being rewarded. And I think that's kind of my way of driving this change is, yes, I want to be acknowledged. Yes, I want to be patted on the back, but only if I'm doing great things. Don't pat the entire team on the back. Pat the people that are driving success. And I guess maybe that's my new way of looking at this whole millennial me approach.
Right, and that's perfect, Brian, because this is the thing, is that every single generation has its own negatives, and I think there's this, it's the same stigma that, and Kristen and Mila have to agree with me as well, like the Gen Xers and the angst and the grudginess that we have because we're kind of overshadowed by the rich boomers and the up-and-coming millennials who will crush us in 10 years. I mean, we got to deal with that, but it doesn't stop us from being necessarily who we are. I want to talk to Bhupesh and Bev or Bev on that point. Can you guys respond to what Brian said?
I agree with Brian. I think the whole idea of labeling is incorrect. It's a generalization, and I like what he was saying about being happy. I mean, I think every generation has that same positioning of, hey, I really don't care as long as I don't hurt anyone else. As long as I'm happy, things are cool. And I'll go about living my life such that I can maximize my happiness without impacting other people's happiness. And I think that's quite respectable, and it's nice to see, as an old guy, it's nice to see a 34-year-old thinking the same way. But all kidding aside, it is fairly universal, and I think the mistake with that generalization is assuming that it's almost like, and I had mentioned earlier, that researchers are putting labels on us based on their own research and generalization. But I think it comes down to convenience. I mean, if you can categorize people in a certain way, then you can sort of predict the behavior, or at least presume to predict behavior, which means your actions can be justified because you can see research shows that this group of individuals behave this way, so this is what we're going to do. I think that's wrong, but I think it's from a business perspective, I understand why this is done.
Okay, so because you've already segued into that, we're going to get into each of our scores because yes, you've had to do this, and I trust Pew Research because they're trying to do this in a very methodical way, where they've asked people to take a test, and at the end of it is that they give you a score, and what I want everyone to talk about is their score and whether or not you actually agree or disagree with it as a Gen X or Boomer or Millennial. Okay, so anything above a 73 is deemed Millennial. Okay, so Bev, why don't we start with you? What was your score when you took the test?
Well, when I took the test, I was an 87. But back to what you guys were talking about, as far as segregating people into these little groups. I mean, even in corporate America, for one, I never know how old you are when you're coming to interview me. I mean, honestly, age to me doesn't mean anything. So I delve more into your experience, what you've done with your life, and that sort of thing. And for me to be a millennial when I'm actually born in 1959 and I should be a baby boomer, but I'm a millennial, but I think I'm more so, not because I'm late, not because I don't care, not because anybody owes me anything. It's more because I'm trying to do the best I can to get ahead, to learn as much as I can, to use technology in ways that I can make my business better than anybody else. The whole reason that I'm doing so well on the island to begin with is because I am a personable person, and I talk to everyone. I'm always smiling. I mean, I'm always on stage, and I don't think you can tell me that because I'm a millennial that, you know, I'm going to be late and I'm not going to do a good job and you owe me something. That's not the case. I work for every penny that I bring into my pocket. So whenever you put people in classes or in groups or whatever, I find that it doesn't work.
Now I want to be clear though, like when we talk about millennial mindset, the reason it is prevailing for all of you is the fact that you know, when you know, a lot of these companies do their research, we have this generation that is going to be the largest in 10 years within the workforce. And so when they've done their research, there is a prevailing view that because of the majority of you guys, there is this there are specific things that predominate, like confidence, self-expressiveness, being liberal, open to change, right? Being a byproduct of the environment, so the ability to hustle, the ability to be more cautious of government, be more cautious of the environment. So those are prevailing views. But what we're saying, what everybody is saying here, is that it's not specific to one generation. It could be carried out through multiple generations. But what we're trying not to do is saying that generations are not boxed in. There are specific traits of a millennial mindset that pervade across generations. And so when we talk about the millennial mindset, it's not about a specific group of people anymore. It's literally about a disposition. That's what I'm trying to get to. So, Kristen,
well said, Hesse. That's well said. I like that. I like that you clarify that, because I think that's what the conversation has to be about. I love that.
Okay, good. Kristen.
Okay, I had this one soundbite that I wanted to wedge in somehow before we got done talking, and it is this. I think that everything that we Gen Xers and young boomers say about millennials is the same thing that our predecessors said about us. It's just that we're able to have conversations in a different way. We're sitting here on a hangout. We're on social media. There's a lot more discussion and a lot more documented discourse on the subject. So that's 2 cents of mine on that. And then in terms of the millennial survey, I scored a 97.
That's awesome.
I actually just tweeted it out. I took a screenshot just to prove that I scored a 97. I still am loyal to my Gen X peeps. I'm not, disavowing my status as Gen X. And I think they did the best that they could with the survey, although some of the questions are barely scratching the surface. For example, one of them was, do you have a tattoo? My answer was yes. But I have a cowardly tattoo. I got a tattoo that no one can see, and I got it just because I don't want to be boxed in. So I don't know if that counts the same way as some of my millennial friends who have 9 tattoos. But the point is, I took the survey, and I scored 97% millennial. So.
Okay. Okay, Ross. First of all, what did you score? And
go ahead.
Go ahead. What did you score, and how did you feel about your score? Did it surprise you?
No, I scored a 66, surprisingly. But I was okay with that for a couple reasons. The analytical side of me instantly was like, okay, let's start picking apart what's wrong with these questions. I don't have a tat, and I don't understand the question about talking to a government, someone from the government. I thought those couple questions were, I understand maybe there's some data that they're tied to somewhere, but I felt at 15 they needed more data points because that was too narrow. Like, whether or not I have a tat or not, I don't think has anything to do with my mindset necessarily. I just don't write on myself. So I think it's just a funny situation where it's like I felt like there could have been some much better questions as far as getting into the mindset that are more like an IQ test in the way where it's not about what you know, it's about your capacity to understand things and how you solve problems, whether you know the answer or not. And I think that when I look at the way that it's set up, 15 questions is definitely too narrow for me.
Yep.
But I thought that when I looked back at it, I thought, I'm okay with being. I thought I'd be probably around that. Once I saw the questions, I figured I'd be in the 60 to 70, range. And I think that there's maybe there's some underpinning there that's even more. I don't go along with the cultural norms, so maybe even I remember when people actually were getting tattoos, and then you watch it kind of come into society more. I worked back in the times where it was like, oh, forget getting hired. If you got a tattoo, you're gonna have a big sticker on your arm, or you're gonna have to wear long sleeves. And at one point I managed for Starbucks, and so they were kind of leading the way and like, ooh, you could have a goatee, or ooh, you could have this. And when you see those little indicators, kind of like indicator species for the culture, they were kind of bringing in that new workplace before other businesses were. They were willing to kind of stretch that out. That being said, I, just like with technology, I jump a generation in technology. I don't upgrade every time. I wait till there's something significant. And so in the same way, there's elements of cultural things that I might look at and just say, not for me, I'll wait for that. It has nothing to do that I'm not progressive. Maybe I'm more progressive than jumping on because everybody's jumping on. That's why I said sometimes those questions hit the mean of the group, and if you're a constant outlier, then you'll never fall into some of those categories.
Yeah, and we can actually talk about. Am I actually echoing again?
No, you're good.
Okay, good. Okay, I want to talk about that at some point, Ross, because I would have definitely saw you as ranking much higher. By the way, Tiffany, what was your score?
I scored an 88.
Okay. So so what did you think about that?
I wasn't surprised. I mean, the questions primarily were over two things. Your adoption of technology for entertainment. Now, you can use those entertainment venue or platforms for business as well, but watching TV, reading a newspaper, playing video games, and whether you use a landline and text messages. And then the other was more of your social consciousness. Do you think interracial marriage is good for society? Were your parents married? Now, that's a different social consciousness, but I think for Generation X and the Millennials, there's a much higher percentage of individuals whose parents weren't married during that time that experienced a divorce or were never married to begin with, and tattoos and piercings. So, I mean, I don't know that any of that defined me as a millennial so much as whether I saw the need for a landline and whether I think it's okay for my boyfriend and I to get married.
Mm-hmm.
So,
okay.
I don't know. It was a fun quiz, but I don't know that I would say that defines a millennial any more than it just defines where the nation's moving.
Does everybody agree with that? What did people think of the test overall? Did they think that the questions actually, as what Ross and Tiffany said, were they indicative of what really defines a millennial? Because there's so many out there, and I struggle with some of the stuff that they've asked, because honestly, I've taken the test twice. The first time I got an 87, the second time I got a 77, and the only real difference between the two is that I did less text messages on the second day, and I didn't watch any TV. So I'm trying to grapple with, like, what are the right things that actually define this millennial mindset, because these questions seem to be a little bit flawed from what you guys are saying.
Well, I also think you have to put in perspective that this was written in 2010. The test was actually released in 2010. I think 2010 to 2014, they didn't ask you if you have adopted Periscope or Meerkat in the last 2 months. They asked you if you adopted text messaging. And I don't think I think now if you ask somebody if they had, instead of the landline versus cell phone question, it should be smartphone versus flip phone. Like, or even have you updated your smartphone in the last 4 years? I think that the concept of the questions are actually kind of are what I expected. But I think part of the question is, like I jokingly talk about, some of the presentations I gave when I used to present at the Pentagon had a picture from my Instagram that showed off my tattoos. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to make a point that just because you see someone with a tattoo that is a younger generation does not mean they don't deserve to be on the stage in front of the government officials that are sitting across from me. But I expected a tattoo question to be in there when you're attempting to label a millennial. But at the same time, and actually I'll drop, Amy tweeted out on Twitter. She said, Brian, take the Gen X test. And I actually laughed about that because in my head, I haven't taken the Gen X test. I haven't looked at it. But I actually thought of it in my head. What questions would I expect to see on a Gen X test? And it would be like, where were you at when Woodstock was happening? What did you think about, I almost, I'm going to generalize that as much as the generalized test that I got from a millennial perspective. So, I mean, I think owning the fact that, I have some hippie traits is very much like me owning the fact that I can't live without my phone being 3.5 feet from me, and I refuse to digitally disconnect. Yes, I admit that, and I understand that that's a millennial label. So I guess that's kind of my take on it, because I expected the test to be that, but 2010 to 2014 or 2015, back to my original point, the rate at change is insane. And I agree, every generation talks about change, but the speed of change for this label is for 20 years. In 20 years, the amount of change that happened is light years different than the amount of change that happened the 20 years prior to it. And I think that kind of is something that we have to factor in because to Ross's point, he wants to label, cut off the middle of the Gen X generation and the middle of the millennial generation, and let's label that generation as, tech savvy, digital change people, right, Ross? I'm not sure if I'm speaking for you, but I kind of agree with that kind of philosophy. But I also realize that there's a 24-year-old Chelsea Cross, who's someone that I work really well with. I mean, she's leading a lot of things on millennial, and yes, she has a little bit different view on millennial, but her and I work really well together because we are trying to drive change in that whole millennial concept. She's 24 and single. I'm 33, married with 3 kids. And I think, when people realize that a millennial can look at both of those stereotypes are the exact same generation, I think it maybe refreshes that label. And sorry, that sounded random.
Okay, so one thing I just do want to correct you on, Woodstock was not Gen X. In fact, anybody.
I didn't mean being at it. I meant you were alive when it was going on. I didn't mean being at it.
I think you should say Michael Jackson. That might be a bit more relevant. But one thing I have to say, Brian, is that when you talk about the rate of change, you have to also remember that when we talk about adoption, we're all products of our environment. So even though you think it may be a millennial thing where there is rapid change and adoption, there are millennials within your generation that don't even get on the bandwagon, right? You agree with that? But there are, but everybody else, so be it Bev, Boopesh, Boomers, Gen Xers, who choose to ride that bandwagon also deal with the rapid change. And it's either it's a choice to do it, or there's a complacency to not want to learn new things. So do you think that's millennial mindset, or do you think that's generational predominantly? And I'm asking Brian.
No, I think that's actually an interesting look at it, because I think part of the discussion there is less about I knocked over my iPad because I can't be not digitally connected. My Periscope that's going on here. No, but I actually think that's actually a great way of kind of refreshing the idea of the mindset, because I think it's partially when I'm talking about mindset, I think it's the ability to embrace change. And I agree that not everyone's the same, because I have 25-year-old friends that have taught me Snapchat, and I have 30-year-old friends that don't even know what Snapchat is. My wife is a teacher and although Twitter has provided me the house that I live on, because I've used Twitter for my personal brand, my wife does not see any value in Twitter, and she's a millennial. So I would say that I'm very open, but I also know Warren Whitlock, which is a friend of mine, he openly put his arm around me in December, and he said, Brian, I will be the first 65-year-old millennial that you're ever best friends with. Because he was out there, he's messaged me the day that Meerkat came out. Brian, have you tested it? What did you think about it? This is what I was using it for. And that ability to kind of jump in and fail fast, to me, identifies a lot of people. And I guess that's why when you asked me the original question, I said change, because technology, yes, social, yes, but for me, it's just that ability to embrace change for what it is, to me, is that millennial mindset.
Okay. Who wants to respond to that? I want to get either a Gen Xer or a Boomer answering. Bev, did you want to talk? Did you want to answer Brian? Because I think your perspective here is probably needed.
Well, as far as change thing, I think as far as my generation goes, or as far as when I think back to all the things that I've gone through. I've gone through, the rotary dial phone that you had to dial with your finger, and then if you messed up the number, you had to hang up and dial again. I mean, even in my small town, we had a party line. I don't think anybody's ever had a party line before, and don't even probably know what it is. But and then we went through 8-track tapes and cassettes and what was it? CDs, DVDs, and then on and on and on. And I noticed on the comments somebody said that they had a 21-year-old. I have, at my age, I have a 21-year-old and a 23-year-old. And they are two totally different young men. One is in the Navy, the 21-year-old, and the 23-year-old, he wants to get a neck tattoo, and he drives a truck. And, I mean, it's totally off the board as far as how people are. And I think we all grow up and we all do the things that we need to do in order for us to get ahead. And I do the things that I do in order to get ahead. It's not because I'm a boomer. If I were a boomer, I'd probably would have been married for 25 years by now, and I don't know, waiting for my grandkids, I guess.
Okay.
But I didn't.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to also say is that we are all pretty much products of our environment. Do we agree? But to different degrees. Okay, so I want somebody to talk about that, because how we deal with the environment or the cards that we're dealt with very much determines how adaptive we are. So does anybody want to talk about that specifically? Because to me, let's say the recession has put us all, depending on our life stage, in very different spots in how we actually survive and how we adapt. Can somebody talk about that? Yeah.
Well, I'll just say real quick.
Okay.
When the recession hit, I was divorced in 2005. For me, it hit in 2007. Everything was going well. I had a condo and everything else, but then 2007 hit, and it was like the bottom dropped out, and I was in between jobs, and I had 2 young boys that I was taking care of, and I mean, the list goes on, but being the woman that I am, I just adapted and moved on and built a better life for myself.
Okay.
I think we all do that as far as who we are.
Yeah, and I think
Okay.
actually I think that's interesting, because I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and I'm proud to be from Pittsburgh, but I also have no plans on moving back there, because I believe that city has never embraced the millennial mindset until as of recently. It's a blue-collared, hard-working town that my family. My dad moved us to Virginia Beach when I was in high school, and I believe that actually had a huge impact on my beliefs on the ability to be a leader and change. Because when I would tell people I was from Pittsburgh, they would immediately say, hardworking, steel town, conservative. And my dad worked at the same company for a long time. He owned companies for a long time. But for me, I was like, well, that doesn't mean just because I was born in Pittsburgh that I had this label on me as well. And I remember, my parents are still married, have always been married, my entire life, and I'm married for a long time. But in Virginia Beach was a very Navy-run military town, and there's lots of single people into their 30s. There's lots of divorce. Lots of my fellow high school friends were divorced. And I think if I lived in Pittsburgh throughout I wonder how much I'd say change enabled I would have been, compared to me growing up in a more changed environment that I lived in Virginia Beach. Because even now, my family, my in-laws that are in Pittsburgh, see a lot of the things that I do as outlandish, and the fact that I have tattoos, and the fact that my dad, who would have never hired somebody with a tattoo until probably I got one, and then he kind of had have to have a rethink of what he thought of that label. But I think your environment has a lot to do with it. But also, I think I always classify this as, if we wanted to look at a different company's culture in, let's say 1990, you didn't really have anywhere to go. And if you didn't know somebody that worked at a different company, you didn't really have much insight into what that company's life was. Today, I can tell you with a live stream what companies are doing in Australia, Japan, Hong Kong, and I think that ability for us to be globally aware and connected to this, it's not the grass is greener on the other side. We can actually see what the grass looks like everywhere else and adapt to this change, where before, growing up in Pittsburgh, being slightly disconnected, if I didn't know somebody that worked for Zappos, I would have never known of an open culture community. But now it's something that is in your face and you can kind of adapt. So I think the growing up, as well as the world we live in today, has really enabled us to be aware of everything that anyone's doing, good and bad.
Yeah, you know what the sad thing about that is, Brian, is that there's so many millennials that I know that there was one time I actually had a call with one of my clients that was part of the consulting company. A millennial there had to actually create a Skype account because he didn't have one. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot of people that are constrained by the work environment that they're in. And if you live in corporate America, there's still this thing called a firewall that doesn't allow you to attach or to access any of your social accounts during the day. And so if 8 hours of your day is influenced by the work you live in, by your work, then that means that you are going to be less adaptive and less technology aware than people like you who totally live in a technology open and testing environment. Do you agree? I mean, let's talk to Mila, because you live in the finance world, and I don't know if you live in compliance and and all those rules. Like there are certain things that people just don't have access to, right?
You know what? I'm a bit of a rule breaker. So I'm going to say, and I really think there's even relevance in this point to talk about environment. So, I mean, what Brian was saying about, stereotypes of where he grew up or where he would have grown up, like it's different from Pittsburgh to, did you say Virginia Beach? I'm sorry. But, yeah, okay, good. That makes a huge difference on the mindset. So here in Quebec, there are some really forward-thinking people, Mitch Joel, Julian Smith. I mean, we've got some big thinkers here. But when you get down to the actual what's happening in business here, I can't say it's, thanks, Bhupesh, I can't say it's anywhere near that. And it's one of the reasons I brought the 140 conference here, because I couldn't find anything going on here like what I was seeing going on in New York. I had to leave where I was to advance, to understand, to participate in conferences. And that's the kind of thing I would do, but would everyone else do it? So I think there are a lot of restrictions. Now in the financial services world, I can tell you in particular with insurance companies, I see a lot of really brilliant ideas coming out of Toronto, for example. We see a lot of, in regard to marketing, so I mean, I'm really limiting myself here, to marketing, but we see a lot more happening there than we would here. And so, the things that can translate into Quebec, for example, definitely have a bit of an impact, but when I see the pickup from, let's say, Quebec brokers versus brokers in the States or brokers in other parts of Canada, I can't say I'm proud of what our general population in Quebec has been doing right now. I'd say we're behind about 5 to 10 years. And that could just be my own bias. Maybe I'm just too demanding, or I want too much. Within my own company, I've managed to accomplish so much. We've been, internally on social networks for 8 years now. And we've done some amazing things. We tested out Ripple, right from the first days. We've been on Yammer for like 4 or 5 years now, I think. Just all kinds of things internally. I've been blogging, we've been doing all this stuff, but I think it has a lot to do with individuals in our society, So I think there's a long way to go in financial services. I think people are very afraid. It's one of the reasons that I do a lot of talking on this subject, because the financial services network could do so much more, but I think there's a lot of fear with legislation and lack of understanding, and so it's it's a little discouraging sometimes, because we have so much opportunity, and yet it's at our fingertips. The world is open to us. We can find out about this, but in general, I don't know that everyone really is.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing here is opportunity, and whether and environment is going to determine what our opportunities are and whether or not we hang on to it. And a lot of us are fortunate that we are in an environment where we actually have that choice. And oh God, it's 9:30 and we have to wrap up. But I want to hold this again, but I want to ask if anybody has any closing remarks on this, because we kind of, in a lot of ways, debunked that Ipsos, it was an Ipsos Pew Research test, because we said there was a lot of it that didn't really fit us, even as Gen Xers or millennials. In a lot of
I want to add something real quick, because I think, Tiffany and I have been on a couple panels, and I'd say we're both older millennials that probably have a different view than a traditional millennial. We kind of, I would say, we wouldn't say we clash on some different things, but I think something that we were doing in the chat, and we've been having a good dialogue in the chat during this one, was we were commenting about all the differences and what change is enabled, and I brought up the concept of happiness, and there's something that I think we just have to kind of look at this whole thing, is that Tiffany and I both might have different beliefs in what the millennials are doing, what the labels are doing, but we both understand and want people to focus on happiness. And I think maybe that's something that is not just a millennial concept, but I think it's just this new way of, let me give you as many resources or take away as many resources as you can so that you can have your own individual happiness. I think maybe that's a takeaway that not all of us always kind of look at, like, I mean, I firmly believe that we are growing a culture that looks at people and say, what happens in your life, what you've chosen to do, if it makes you happy, why should anyone be able to force something upon you? And I think that's part of this whole idea of being a little bit more liberal, a little bit more driving change. But like, I love educated discussions. I love different perspectives. I think that's partially, like, Tiffany and I are even two millennials that are in the same age range of the millennials and kind of look at things slightly different, but we can agree on like a happy principle of, if both of us are focusing on happiness, we're going to support the hell out of each other. And I think that's kind of a perfect takeaway, because I love this panel. I love learning from how everybody kind of looks at this discussion. Kudos, Hesse, thanks for having me on and putting this together. I think we need to drive more of these conversations, because it only helps educate the community as a whole.
And I think, and Tiffany, did you want to respond to what Brian said? Because I wasn't paying attention to the chat, but I mean, it's good that you have those perspectives. And you know what? Honestly, Brian, I wish if I were an angsty Gen Xer, I would actually think of being happy one of these days.
Well, and I think one thing that I'm completely biased because I work in workforce development, so that is my life, is helping people get jobs every day. And I think part of the things that we don't recognize is that some people, their happiness isn't going to come from the work they do. They may be proud of it, but their happiness, work may be a venue to do something they really want to do. And we don't often have those conversations, because we should grow in your business and everything should be about work. Some people want to be a worker bee and take that money and make that money something that's important. And I think we're seeing that shift in millennials, and we don't know how to have those conversations. Yeah,
and I think that this is, if your generation is truly going to influence how things are done, then maybe those are the types of conversations that need to happen. And if the things that you value, like the happiness and being able to do really, really good work with passion without money being the actual incentive, then those are the conversations that need to be had. And like I said, like these days it's so realistic. We're all living in an environment where it's realistic to believe that there will be no corporate ladder anymore. Now it's about doing really, really great work and being able to get compensated duly, but it's not about getting rich. It's about maybe these days surviving and being, I guess, just happy, right? So I think what we're going to do is we're going to drive another session like this, because there's so many other subtopics within this, and then we can figure out other definitions that fit within this millennial mindset, and I'd love to have you all back. And I apologize, everybody has just too much brain power and too many good things to say that we really couldn't pack it in within an hour. But thank you again for coming, and if you want to stay on for a little bit, we can chat a little bit, okay? So thanks everybody, and say goodbye, okay? Take care.